Good evening, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm Nancy Edwards. I'm curator of European art and head of academic services at the Kimball. We have all been thrilled with the enthusiastic response to the exhibition Art and War in the Renaissance, the Battle of Pavia tapestries that opened just a month ago. Visitors have been awestruck by the panoramic display of 7 immense, luxurious tapestries that are on loan from the Capodimonte Museum in Naples, along with exquisitely crafted arms and armor. The tapestries rank among the very finest artistic achievements of the Renaissance, and likewise, the Battle of Pavia itself was critical for determining the geopolitical map of Europe. The narrative of the battle in the tapestries is packed with fascinating details that command attention and very often raise our curiosity. We're very fortunate to have as our speaker this evening one of the foremost experts in military history, Clifford Rogers, to help us appreciate the action that unfolds in the tapestries. Dr. Rogers is professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, where he has since 1995 taught medieval history and the history of warfare. He has been a Fulbright Fellow at the Institute of Historical Research, an Olin Postdoctoral Fellow at Yale, and the Leverhulme Visiting Professor at the University of Wales, Swansea. His research specialty is medieval warfare, and he's written 4 books on the subject, 2 of which, War Cruel and Sharp, English Strategy under Edward III, 1327 to 1360, and Soldiers' Lives Through History, the Middle Ages. Those 2 books received the Vergruen Prize from Duré Militari. He's also the editor or the co-editor of 20 volumes of the Journal of Medieval Military History, of the widely read The Military Revolution Debate, and of 7 more books, 3 of which have received Army Historical Foundation Distinguished Writing Awards. In addition, he's the editor-in-chief of the 3-volume Oxford Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare and Military Technology, and for that, he received the Society of Military History's Distinguished Book Award, and co-senior editor of the 71-chapter West Point History of Warfare, and that is an interactive military history textbook that received in 2016 the Society for Military History George C. Marshall Foundation Prize for the use of digital technology in teaching military history. In 2018, he received the Bachrach Medal from Duré Militari, and in 2020, and this is a particularly nice award among the many other I have mentioned, he was awarded West Point's highest teaching recognition, the Dean's Award for Career Teaching Excellence. So please join me in welcoming tonight Clifford Rogers.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for the opportunity to come to the Kimball Museum and see these amazing tapestries, which I had never seen myself before coming here, and to speak to you this evening to put them in a certain amount of context and hopefully give you some interesting things to think about. Now, you can see on the left here my agenda, and I'm just going to dive right into it because I've got a lot to talk about and a limited amount of time to do it, and I do want to have some time at the end for questions and answers. And my focus is very much going to be on the Battle of Pavia and on battle in general, not warfare writ large. So I'm only very briefly going to give you a little bit of, very, very briefly, of the context that Pavia is one of the most important battles of the Wars of Italy, which are a sequence of invasions and counter-invasions in which in essence, we have a struggle for dominance within Italy, and more specifically for control of the Kingdom of Naples and also the Duchy of Milan within Italy, which both the Habsburg and Valois dynasties claim as their inheritance. The Habsburgs being the Holy Roman Emperors, and after 1519, under Charles V, also the rulers of Spain, whereas the Valois dynasty in 1525, headed by King Francis I, are the rulers of France. And in the year before the Battle of Pavia, I actually don't know how many times, I think the fourth time, the French had occupied the Duchy of Milan and then been driven out of it. This is something that the wars had been going on since 1494. The French kept invading over the Alps, making gains, and then losing them because it's easier to capture something than it is to hold it, is one of the big lessons of military history writ large. And that's especially true if what you're trying to hold on to is on the opposite side of a mountain range, like the Alps. And so anyway, the French had invaded, occupied Milan, been driven out, and then been counterattacked by an imperial army. And the imperial forces besieged Marseille on the Mediterranean coast, but found they were overextended, just as the French had been on their side of the Alps, and had to retreat as Francis took advantage of the fact that his country was being invaded to rally support and troops and bring a substantial army up against the imperial invasion force. And so you see then the imperial forces having to retreat all the way back. And they were not only being essentially pursued by the army that had been opposing them at the siege of Marseille under Montmorency, but also two additional French forces had crossed the Alps and were threatening to cut them off. So they were basically rushing to get back to Milan. And when they got to Milan, they saw these much larger forces converging on them, and they realized that they were going to have to give up even Milan, and kept retreating. At that point, the French had largely accomplished the objective of seizing control of the Duchy of Milan, and including the capital, Milan itself. But they realized that, as they had just seen in the previous year, it's easier to get there than it is to stay there. And that's especially true if there is a still large, not as large as yours, but a still large imperial army basically hovering right outside your grasp. And so King Francis realized that the best thing for him would be to fight a decisive battle while he had the advantage in numbers. And he knew also that the imperial forces, who came to be commanded by the Viceroy of Naples, Lannoy, were they knew that too, and so they weren't likely to oblige him unless he came up with some way essentially to force them to fight a battle. In this period, it was much more common than in, say, the Napoleonic period to just avoid battle and let the enemy wear themselves out with run out of money, run out of supplies, and just sort of collapse without fighting a battle. And you could do that in part because there were so many fortresses that the defender could use as bases from which to harass the enemy and basically just to frustrate them, just to prevent them from accomplishing a territorial conquest in a way that they could consolidate. And so as actually part of that basic idea, in fact, the Imperials had left a large garrison of about 8,000 men in Pavia, which was basically just to deny that to the French and prevent them from being able to really exercise control. Because if there's 8,000 men, right outside of Milan, you're secure on Milan. Your control of Milan is not very secure at all. You can't have tax collectors going out, things like that. But that also was a hostage to fate. And Francis realized that if he brought the French army down and besieged Pavia, then that would then put the burden of action onto the Imperials. Because if he besieged Pavia long enough that it was about to have to surrender, lack of food, lack of money, then the Imperials would face a really tough decision. They would either have to choose to fight a battle that they didn't want to fight, or they would suffer a very major loss. Both Pavia itself, which was a wealthy and strategically important city, but maybe even more importantly, the 8,000 men or so that had been left to defend Pavia would be captured, and that would be pretty disastrous. So Francis's plan is to besiege Pavia and use that essentially as bait to draw the Imperials into a fight, with the backup plan that if it doesn't succeed in drawing them into a fight, the consolation prize is Pavia and the garrison, which is a pretty darn good consolation prize. All right, so this is actually from a contemporary, closely contemporary, reasonably contemporary depiction of Pavia at the time of the siege. And I want to orient you to this. Of course, the tapestries are so beautifully episodic. You know, they have these flashes of action, but they don't give you sort of a sense of the flow of action very well, or the topography. And this does a little bit better. This is very simplified, but the main thing I want you to see here is that Pavia, with the ducal castle, the ducal castle is at the north end of the city. This is north. On this map, it's not oriented with north at the top. And so north of the city, the Dukes of Milan had built a gigantic, thousands of acres, gigantic hunting park with walls, and sources vary about how high they were, but they were basically high enough to keep the deer in and the peasants out. And reserved that area for the hunting of the Duke and his guests. And they had a fancy palace called Mirabello, which means basically looks good, in the center of the park. Okay, so again, this is to the north, and there's a sort of a wedge-shaped park surrounded by substantial walls, not like fortress walls, but still pretty substantial all the way around the park. Now, this is a rather less artistically sophisticated version, also about contemporary, and actually its very simplicity is useful for me in sort of orienting you and boiling down a very, very complicated thing to something that's easy enough to pick up during a lecture. So one thing to notice is that Pavia is on the north bank of the Ticino River, and although there are a few French forces on the south, the city is on the north. It's defended by the French on the north. They're expecting a counterattack to come from the north, and the south is basically just the refuge to which the French, some of them, managed to escape after the battle. So we can sort of ignore it. North of the city, here is that park and the ducal castle that I was talking about, right? It is split right down the middle, basically, by the Vernivola stream. There's another stream over here, okay? And those walls and those streams have the effect of splitting the French army into 3 main parts or 4 main parts, depending on how you count it. They're organized in 3. So they've got a rear guard over here under the Duc d'Alençon, a vanguard over here under Montmorency, which is, although you don't really see it here, is behind earthworks. And then the main force under Francis is in the park that I was just describing, where they feel safe and comfortable. And plus, it's just a very pleasant park. That's the whole point. And so King Francis is in there. He's brought his hunting birds, actually. He's got his falcons. So good place to be in the park, and a hunting park, when you've got your falcons with you. And Florence is one of his subordinates who is in command of the Swiss pike mercenary and some light cavalry. And these 2 forces are, one, administratively, the center division, but they are physically separated by the Renovola stream that runs through the middle of the park. Okay, and the basic idea, again, that Francis has is he wants the Imperials to come fight him, and more specifically, he wants them to come attack him, because in the battles of the Italian wars so far, there have been a whole series of them where the victor has essentially held a fortified camp and repulsed attacks and won the battle that way. And there was also one where that didn't work, but there have been several where it did work. So that's what Francis wants to do. And he's got these guys dug in behind trenches and ramparts of earthwork. And again, for his main force, he's mainly relying on these park walls, which are not like city walls, but again, they're substantial enough that they're weak enough that they could be pretty rapidly battered down by cannon, but they're strong enough and big enough that if you did knock them down with cannon, you'd have a big pile of rubble, which would be a pretty good barrier to fight from behind. So he's waiting for that to happen, and he's got artillery in place, which you see well in the tapestries. If you were wondering, actually, you may have noticed in the tapestries, there's a lot of what are called gabions, which if I had thought of it, I would have put an image of right here. But they're basically the cylinders that you see with cannon sticking out between them everywhere. What they are is basically low-tech sandbags. Instead of having a bag, you weave a basket with reeds and sticks. And then you fill it with dirt, and dirt is really good at stopping even cannonballs, but certainly musket balls. So if you ever need to defend yourself against artillery, and all you got is some sticks, it actually is quite. They're used all the way through the American Civil War. You can find them in photos of fortifications that were made in the American Civil War. All right, and so Montmorency has some of those around his position. Okay, now moving on to a modern map. Again, you see the same basic idea that you just saw over here very simply. You've got Pavia, you've got the park, and you can see how big it is, and you've got d'Alençon and Montmorency and the stream. Okay? So, and you've got then Lanois. Now again, Francis wants to make use of his earthworks and the walls and get the Imperials to attack him. And one of the basic principles of war is whatever your enemy wants you to do is probably not what you want to do. So Lanois is not dumb, and he realizes that. Now he knows, again, that Francis has succeeded on shifting the burden of action onto him. He needs to act. If everybody just sits where they are, then Pavia is going to fall and the garrison is going to be captured. Right? Lanois knows that. But he also realizes, and so I should add to that being on the offensive, if you're making a frontal attack into the fortifications, is a big disadvantage. It's much harder to attack somebody who's behind a wall or a ditch than it is to repulse somebody from behind the wall or the ditch. And so Lanois realizes that would not be a good idea. But he also knows that there is an advantage to the offense, which can actually outweigh the advantages of the defense in cover, concealment, and preparation. And that's especially true when the defenders are, as the French had to be, and even more so were, spread out, which is that the defender never knows when the attack is going to come. He can't be ready everywhere and at all times. So he's going to be waiting as you can seize the initiative and move with your whole force against just part of his. That is like the most basic thing there is about warfare, is that balance between the attack and the defense. And Lanois, instead of just doing what the French want him to do, realizes that he can move up here. And if he can get to Castle Mirabello, one, he hopes he might actually capture King Francis, because he thinks that's where King Francis is staying. But he can also then separate these two parts of the French and beat them before these other parts of the French can even really do anything. And he thinks he can do that And he turns out to be right if he moves at night with pretty much his whole force. He leaves like 1,000 or 2,000 men here to hold his camp and his earthworks. And he takes his whole force in a night march, which is why you'll see some of the arquebusiers in the tapestry wearing white shirts over their armor and over their fancy, Landsknecht clothes with the ripped cloth poking through and all that stuff. They're wearing white shirts over their normal clothes to be more visible in the night march so that they can see each other. They still won't be visible enough, for the French to notice them. And he does it in a storm to help the cover. And he also has engineers and laborers up there breaching the park wall, not with cannon, not with a big barrel full of gunpowder, just with hand tools. So it won't be so loud that the quite distant, this is almost 2 kilometers away, French forces will hear it and react. They may have patrols. By the time patrols hear it and do anything about it, it'll hopefully be too late. And in fact, that is pretty much what turns out to be the case. So there are 3 main elements coming through, probably 3 breaches in the walls. The ones who come in first are, again, these arquebusiers, and arquebusier is basically handgunners, and I'll talk more about the arquebus and the arquebusier when I get to my technology section. They come in first under the Marquis del Vasto, and they actually succeed in capturing Castle Mirabello with almost no fighting. The French are just completely unready for them. They haven't really garrisoned it anyway. Francis has moved to a different part of the park as his main camp. So they don't capture Francis, but they capture the stronghold in the center with almost no effort. These guys are followed. Del Vasto is followed by his cousin, the Marquis of Pescara, who is leading in Spanish light horse, Imperial heavy cavalry, and then Landsknecht infantry. So the Landsknechts are basically German copies of the Swiss, who are the best infantry, or reputed to be the best infantry in Europe at that time, who look more like this. And so those elements are all coming on the west side of the brook. And on the east side, there's a quite large force of just Landsknechts coming down towards their equivalents, the Swiss under Florence, who are over here. Now, once Del Vasto's arquebusiers capture Castle Mirabello, they don't get Francis, but they do see right in front of them a treasure trove, the French camp, where all the merchants and wine sellers and prostitutes and laundresses and camp followers of various sorts are set up in their tents, and they just start plundering it. And that's shown in the tapestry pretty well. That effectively takes them out of the action for a while. And while they're doing that, and their follow-on forces are just sort of coming in through the breaches after them, Francis has realized that there's a fight on and has mustered his heavy cavalry. Probably takes about half an hour for those guys to wake up, put on their armor, which is so elaborate, as you've seen in the exhibition, get their horses saddled up by their grooms, come up and form into their formation. But once they've done that, they see, again, in front of them, the Spanish and Imperial cavalry, which is inferior to them in numbers and inferior to them in weight. It's less, well, actually, even the heavy cavalry on the Imperial side is lighter and less elite than the French cavalry. So Francis had fought in Italy before in 1515. He had fought at the Battle of Marignano, where he had led his cavalry into action personally with pretty good success. The French won the battle. He'd actually made 30 charges. He reported in his own letter. Obviously, no one of those charges was very successful if it took 30 of them. But collectively, they made a big contribution to winning the battle. So that was his past experience. And unsurprisingly, the way he applied it was charging again. And this time he was not charging pike, which he'd been doing at Marignano. He was charging other cavalry, which is what cavalry love to do. That's definitely the best thing to charge is other cavalry. It's the most glorious thing to do. It's what you, especially if you're the French, you expect to definitely win because you're the best. And so that expectation proves fully justified. The French charge just immediately disperses the the Imperial cavalry, both the heavy and the light troops. But the problem for Francis is that once he's cleared away the enemy cavalry, he comes up on the woods that they had just come through. And not only can you not charge into woods with cavalry, you can't even charge people who are standing in front of woods with cavalry. Because what you need to do when you're charging with cavalry is pass through the enemy. It's kind of like if any of you have done taekwondo or karate and you have to punch a board. You break a board with a punch. And what they teach you, and this is really important, is don't punch the board. If you punch the board, you will break your hand. You need to punch through the board. And that actually worked for me. So I think it actually is true. And it's definitely the same with cavalry. If you charge up to the enemy and get stopped, you're in big trouble. What you want to do is charge through. But if you're charging through and they're standing in front of woods, no, that doesn't work, right? So you can't do that. And these are not just woods. These are woods filled with infantry, both pikemen and arquebusiers. And the pikemen can't form up properly in the woods, but they don't really need to because the trees will block, again, a vigorous charge. And if you just ride up to them slowly, then they'll stand there and they'll poke at you until you die. Well, actually, they probably won't poke at you until you die. What they'll actually do is they'll poke at your horse until it dies. But I'll come back to that point later. All right. So Francis has succeeded in his charge, but now he is stalled. Meanwhile, by the way, over on the other side of the battlefield, the two big pike forces have clashed. They're fighting. It's a very sort of slow attritional blowtorch against blowtorch. That's going to be going on while the next action takes place over here. The next action over here is that the Marquis del Vasto rallies the guys who have been pillaging the French camp. He basically says to them, if we win this battle, you'll have plenty of plunder. If we don't, the plunder you've taken so far isn't going to do you any good. And that works. He gets his arquebusier back into action. And they are shooting at these poor French cavalry. You got to feel sorry for them because they can't go forward for reasons I already explained. They can't go north because the wall's there. They can't go south they could maybe try attacking the arquebusier who are shooting at them now. But the basic problem is they're too close. To be an effective cavalry charge, you need to have room to get moving. And they could turn around, actually. That's the one thing they could do. Except they can't turn around because that would be cowardly, and they're knights, and so they would rather, honestly. And this sounds like rhetoric, but it's true. Most of them would rather die than turn and run from infantrymen. And a lot. So what happens? Well, a lot of them die, and while a lot of them are dying, one of these arquebusiers shoots King Francis's horse. A lot of men dying in, a lot of horses dying there. And when Francis's horse falls down, and again, around him, he's been seeing his companions, the heavy cavalry, the elite of his army, have just been, many of them dying or losing their horses. And at that point, seeing this sort of collapse of the French cavalry. And probably even before they see King Francis himself go down, the infantry that was in the woods starts coming out at them. And perhaps more importantly, the light cavalry under Marquis de Pescara, who is part of the Davilo family that winds up owning the tapestries, charges in and helps ensure that when Francis goes down, he is captured. So it's the King of France is captured. This is the worst day for the Kingdom of France since Agincourt, at least as far as the monarchy is concerned. And probably the worst one until Waterloo, I think, would be the next time that anything that bad happens to the French. Again, from the perspective of the monarchy. So not only are the French collapsing here, but their Swiss pikemen, their most elite infantry, are meanwhile also collapsing east of the brook. Not probably because they know about Francis. You know, people say, "Oh, Francis is captured, and that's terribly demoralizing for the French army." That's actually probably not it, because I don't think they really have any idea about that. How would they know about that? They can't see it. It's early morning. There's a lot of mist coming up from the brook. I don't think there's a trumpet signal that says, "Oh, we captured the king." It's basically just that they're fighting almost identical troops and they're badly outnumbered. So they lose. And it's not that shocking for the Swiss to lose. They've lost before. What is shocking to European opinion is that they don't just lose, they run away. In past battles, when they lost, they back out. You know, they face off, they back out, they hold the enemy at bay, and they minimize their losses, but not at Pavia. And their military reputation actually really never fully recovers from this. And they become just another set of mercenary infantry, not the best, which they had generally been considered up to this point. All right, so at this point, as the tapestry spends a lot of space illustrating, the French are running away. They're running away in every direction, all of them. They're trying to get away. They've lost the battle. And so you see them running down to the Ticino, where Montmorency is, and Montmorency's guys, who, by the way, also have been fighting a sally of the garrison, which has come out to attack them, and which is shown in the tapestry. So they're running away. The Duc d'Alençon, who actually is shown right there, leads his men or takes his men across the Ticino, across a bridge of boats, a pontoon bridge, and then orders it be demolished, which the tapestry shows because it's a big deal. That's really cool for the Imperials, that the enemy's so afraid of you that they're breaking the bridge behind them. And the Duke of Alençon, one of the three top commanders of the French, is running away from you. Of course, the camp followers are running away. And the Swiss, like I said, the shock there is not just that they lose, but some of them break and run, and others of them, as the tapestry very well shows, although I didn't make this quite big enough for you to really see it, the Swiss are shown surrendering with their weapons in piles dropped on the ground and their hands up. Again, that's a big shocker for European opinion. Okay, so that basically is the Battle of Pavia, and that's the basic narrative. Just to recap, like even more simply, and going back to another contemporary print, so you've got on one side of the brook a big pike against pike fight, and on the other side of the brook the capture of the King of France inside the park near Mirabello. Okay, so this is a super simple depiction of the battle, but it sort of helps you remember the basics of what happened. But it also is actually really significant in terms of the topic I'm going to move on to now, which is the technology and how war is changing. So the reason I say that is because of how it's wrong. How it's wrong is really informative. Because when an artist like Jorg Breu makes a print of the battle, he's got a pretty limited amount of information to work with. And so he's trying to combine that with a depiction of how he knows battles are, right? I know Pavia, I know this about Pavia, and I know a lot about battles in general. So I'm going to mash those together and make an image of it, and I'll sell 1 million copies. So the ways that this is wrong don't come from the bad information he's getting about Pavia. They come from his understanding about the way that battle is. Right? And one of the really striking things about this battle, I mean, of course, also some of it is just that he has to fit it within a frame and it's artistic reasons and so on. But one of the really striking things about that is if you look all through this print, almost everybody is either a pikeman, well, with a few halberdiers mixed in, or cavalry. The only missile troops, which is to say troops who attack with weapons that hit from a distance, are two. These two arquebusiers, even though, as you know from both my description and hopefully from looking at the tapestry, there are lots of gunners participating in this battle. But people in Germany in 1526 didn't really expect gunners to play a big part in battle. So when he made the print, the gunners don't play a big part in the battle. And neither do any other missile troops, right? He has the two guys with arquebuses, which are these matchlock, essentially muskets. Technically in this period, a musket is just a heavier version of the arquebus that nobody's really using at Pavia, or very few. But the arquebus that you've seen some examples of in the exhibition, although with the difference that the ones in the exhibition are finer hunting, they're lighter weapons, and they have wheel lock mechanisms, which work by using a spring to drive a flint down against a spinning iron wheel, creating sparks to set off the priming charge, which sets off the main charge, which sends the bullet. Those are very expensive. Nobody has those. They haven't even been invented by the time of Pavia. And even if they did, nobody would have them because they're too expensive, except a few nobles. Instead, they have a much simpler way of igniting, which is with a match. They're called matchlocks. What is a match? A match is basically a thin rope soaked in saltpeter so that it will smolder for a long time, kind of like the wick of a candle. And so they have coils of match, of which the end fits through a serpentine little clip. They pull the trigger, that comes down, that hits priming powder that they've poured from their horns that you see some of them carrying. Okay, they pour a little fine-grained priming powder into the pan. The match comes down and hits the priming charge. That creates a flash, hopefully, but not always. Some of that fire goes through a hole bored in the side of the barrel to hit the main charge of gunpowder and propel the bullet. If it doesn't, now the place where you're putting that priming powder is called the pan of the gun. And if it doesn't succeed, then what you have is a flash in the pan. So if you've ever heard that expression, that's where that comes from. Something happens, but it doesn't do anything. Okay. Yeah, it's this language actually of early modern Renaissance warfare actually hits our language in all kinds of ways. Like, for example, lock, stock, and barrel. Those are the parts of an arquebus. The lock is the mechanism, the stock, and the barrel. All right. So the arquebus is only one of three major types of missile weapons that are being used in this period. In addition to the arquebus, the English, but only the English, are still using the longbow. That's actually a really terrific weapon, except it has one huge disadvantage, which is that only English longbowmen can use it. And they have to train because only basically if you come from a culture where that's what you do every Sunday, do you get the musculature and the skill to be able to handle an English longbow. They have draw weights of like 150 pounds. So, I mean, it's just completely off the charts compared to anybody else's bows. Even the Ottomans. You also have the crossbow, which is what the French are using at the Battle of Marignano just 10 years before Pavia. It doesn't require anybody special. Anybody can learn to and have the strength to use a crossbow. It's got a couple of disadvantages. It's slow. It only fires maybe a couple bolts per minute, as opposed to the longbow can shoot 6, no problem, 9 even. And it actually has about the same range, but it's actually less accurate. The longbow is actually pretty amazingly accurate for these people who practice with it already time. There's actually, right in this period, there is a statute enacted by Henry VIII of England, which sets a minimum target practice range for adults with the longbow. Anybody want to guess? 220. Yeah. Whereas arquebus practice is done at 120 yards typically, and they set up butts that are, targets that are like 16 feet wide and 8 feet high, whereas the archery targets are archery targets like you're familiar with, about 18-inch circles. So longbow has a lot of advantages over an arquebus, and even the crossbow does. Compared to crossbow, an arquebus shoots much slower. Instead of 2 times per minute, it's more like a time per 2 minutes. So about 1/4 the rate of fire. And it's much less accurate at anything beyond point blank range. Muskets are accurate up to about 75 yards, but for a couple of reasons, one of which is the Magnus effect, if anybody does physics, which I can explain if there's a question afterwards. But the other is that the ball just basically doesn't fit the barrel that tightly. It bounces around just a little bit as it comes out of the barrel, and it can, sort of graze off and go off to the left, off to the right. And that actually doesn't matter that much if you're shooting at a line of infantry, but it can also go up or down, and that does matter, right? If it goes into the ground or over their heads, it doesn't do any good. And the Magnus effect doubles down on that process. These are not rifles. In some of the materials that you've seen for the exhibition, the arquebusiers are called riflemen. That is wrong. What makes a rifle is that it has rifling. Rifling is grooves in the barrel that cause the bullet to spin. If it spins perpendicularly to the trajectory, it is much more accurate. That's also why arrows have 3 feathers on them. It makes them spin perpendicularly to the trajectory. Muskets don't have that, so that makes them much less accurate over any distance. So it's much less accurate. It shoots much slower. It has the same degree of difficulty. Why would anybody use it? Well, the basic answer to that is the other piece of technology I want to talk about, which is armor. If you look at the tapestry, this looks like super high technology, right? And it is. But it's not really new technology. Well, actually it is, but it's not new technology in a way that you might think from looking at it. It's not new outwardly because it's basically the same outwardly as armor that had already been used for over 100 years. This is from 1414. This is from 1530. It's basically the same. There's a little bit more fluting and elaboration, but it's still sheets of metal over every inch of your body from the tip of your toes to the tip of your head. The real huge technological innovation that changes things is actually the metallurgy, not the design of the armor. Around this very time of Agincourt, smiths in Milan, the same Milan that they're fighting over, developed the technique of quenching armor after they forge it. Swords had always been quenched. When you heat it up, you forge it, you get it the way you want it, and you basically dump it in a bucket or put it in a bucket of water. It causes the carbon and the steel to form martensite, which is super hard. But they didn't know how to do that with pieces of armor without making them brittle or warping until the 15th century. And that very high technology method of making armor didn't become widespread until about the time of the Battle of Pavia. And this doesn't just make a difference, this makes a big difference in the quality of the armor. By the Vickers hardness scale, quench steel armor of medium carbon compared to somewhat lower carbon air-cooled steel has double the hardness, which means it requires about double the energy to break through it. And why that's so important is because the energy that you're using to break through armor in 1415 is coming from human muscle power, or, a little bit more lethal horse muscle power, if you can ram into somebody with a lance that you've got couched. But it's still muscle power. And that only scales so far. And at the Battle of Agincourt, the armor and the arrows, again from these super strong English bows, are fairly in balance. But the human body has been maxed out by that. Okay? So when you get armor that's twice as tough, it goes from being sort of barely penetrable and you might occasionally kill somebody to these guys are practically invulnerable to crossbow bolts or arrows. Okay? You can't go through that armor. And if you look in the tapestry, you'll see plenty of people getting killed, but it's mostly unarmored people getting killed. Here you have a guy with torso armor getting killed, but only because the pikeman has managed to find a spot where he can get him without going through the plate. It's going into the armpit where there's just some mail, not the plate. This guy in the exhibition, it talks about this two-handed swordsman having broken this pike. I'm pretty sure that's not actually what this is showing, because if it were, if he had just like swacked down on the pike and broken it, the back of the pike would be up and the tip would be down, right? So I'm pretty sure what this is actually showing is this pikeman just stabbed really hard into the chest of this swordsman and discovered that it takes more energy to get through the plate than it does to break the pike. So the hand-powered weapons that are being used are actually, they're still plenty good. There's still plenty people that you can kill with them, but not the fully armored men. Unless, of course, you're using the arquebus, because that is not bound by the limits of human muscle power. That is kinetic energy coming from chemical energy. It's really only the second major harnessing of chemical energy by humanity after fire is gunpowder. And you can put a lot of energy behind a musket ball using just basic black powder. You can see here, right, a modern, a crossbow or arrow bolt might be, a crossbow bolt or longbow arrow, even from the super, super strong English longbows, might be only about 150 joules. So what you can get from an arquebus is not double, not quadruple, not 4, 6, or 8 times. It's like 20 times almost the kinetic energy that you are producing from a 1 ounce lead, putting behind a 1 ounce lead ball driven by a 1 ounce charge of black powder. And that will kill French cavalry, heavy, fully armored French cavalry. And so if you're comparing it to a crossbow, it really doesn't matter how accurate your bolt is or how quickly you can shoot it if when it gets there, it just bounces off, right? Much better to have 1 lethal musket ball than 500 Nerf balls. So the way that warfare and tactics and battle develop after that for the rest of the 16th century is kind of an effort to say, oh, wow, look what happened at Pavia. Those arquebusiers are really lethal. They were only so effective at Pavia because of special circumstances, the difficult terrain, the surprise, the trees that they could work from. And you need to have a tactical system that will enable you to not have to have a woods to be in. So how do you protect your musketeers? Because like I said, the musketeer is really lethal the 1 shot in 2 minutes that it gets, right? So it doesn't take anywhere near 2 minutes for a cavalryman to ride in from outside of arquebus range and, or even just a guy with a rock to run in and bash you over the head. So what you have to do is figure out ways for the arquebus seers not to get killed before they're able to deliver this ridiculous firepower that they can deliver against the enemy. And the secret to that turns out to be what they were already using in large numbers, which is pikemen. And the way they do that is they will organize, and this is actually a very early depiction of this from shown at the Battle of Pavia from another etching, is they'll organize blocks of pike, which they've been doing forever. Well, not forever, but since the 15th, 14th century. And they'll put sleeves, as they call them, of shot, of arquebusiers and later musketeers, on the side of them. And that means that if anybody tries to charge the arquebusier with cavalry or pike or whatever, they can essentially just be sheltered by the pikemen that they're standing next to, because the pikes get to be even longer than they are shown here. These are shown as about 12-foot pikes. Pretty soon they're 18 feet. And they can just basically reach out past the arquebusier and stop somebody from overrunning them. But they don't actually fight in those sleeves. This is an eyewitness depiction of the Battle of Pavia in 1546. And you can see that you have the pike blocks of the English each have sleeves of, actually this only has one apparently, sleeves of shot. This has two, this has two. But they don't just stand on the side of the pikes and shoot. Because they don't really have a tactical drill that will enable them to make anybody but the first rank effective if they're just doing that. Instead, they come forward and they basically skirmish. They could be overrun by enemy pike or enemy cavalry, except that that doesn't happen at the Battle of Pavia because the Scots don't have that. They've got twice as many pikemen, hardly any arquebusier, and no cavalry to speak of. So the English cavalry holds them in place by charging them. Every time they do that, there's a early modern text that says that if you're charging pike with cavalry, you have as much chance of breaking them as you do reaching the skin of a hedgehog with your bare thumb. But they don't need to break the pike. They just need to force it to stand and defend itself. And that halts it and prevents it from moving forward and trying to capture the guns or overrun the arquebusier, who would also be vulnerable to enemy cavalry, again, if the English cavalry weren't controlling the field. It's basically a rock, paper, scissors situation. Arquebusier beats pike, pike beats cavalry, and cavalry beats arquebusier. Right? So you need to have all three of them working together effectively in order to have really effective tactics. And this is kind of a long quotation, but it really brings forward very well the nature of tactics in this era. And the gist of it is, as I said a minute ago, it says, hey, the number one most important thing, if you only had one, the one that would be the best is arquebusier. If you have even fewer than pike, they'll beat the pike. If you just have one sort of each, because basically they'll shoot at it, and then if it charges them, they'll run away and come back. But they're still vulnerable to enemy cavalry, and so you really need to have the three elements working together. And this whole idea of combined arms that people have been talking about a lot ever since is really developed in the 16th century. This core idea that each of them, each type of weapon, each type of troops takes care of a weakness that one of the others has. All right, so I'm running real low on time. If I want to save some for question and answer, which I do. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through this last topic, which is the face of battle. Now, remember, I already showed you that it's very tough to kill people in armor. It's especially tough to do so if they're still in formation. Once they're out of formation, you can do things like find a weak spot, hit them from the side, clock them on the back of the head. But if they're in formation, you can't get at their back or their side. That's the whole point of being in formation, really. And so in medieval battles, where most combatants were armored and fighting in formation, what tended to happen is that during the fighting, you would get a lot of people wounded and almost nobody gets killed. A lot of people get killed in medieval battles, but it's not while the fighting is really going on. It's after the fighting is over, when one side breaks and runs, as, for example, the Swiss did at Pavia. And you can see in the tapestries, lots of them getting killed after they have, and even the cavalry getting killed from behind by Spanish light cavalry after they've broken and run. But once, and this doesn't really happen so much at Pavia, it does a little bit, but once the influence of Pavia has played out and you get to armies that are not 10% arquebusier, which was common before Pavia, but instead 25 or 30% arquebusier, and where you've realized that, hey, the pike are basically just there to protect the arquebusier. They're not doing much of the killing anymore. The killing is being done by arquebusier, mostly. And what that creates is a situation where lots of people are dying on both sides while the fighting is going on, not just after. And that creates a fundamental change in the requirements of military courage. Not just the kind of courage that makes you bold in attack, but you need to have the courage to go into battle knowing that regardless of anything you do, doesn't matter how good a swordsman you are, it doesn't matter how expensive your armor is, you have a pretty good chance of not coming out of that battle. And you've got to just stand there and suck up the fire and out-endure the enemy. And that becomes a fundamental characteristic of Western warfare that you don't much see when Western armies in the age of exploration right at this time go out and meet other people. There are plenty of brave warriors all over the world, but they don't have the culture of endurance in warfare that European troops do, that they have to have in order to stand up to prolonged arquebus and also artillery fire as a result of the changes in warfare, which aren't caused by Pavia. They'd begun before Pavia, but they're accelerated by Pavia and by quite a lot. And Pavia really makes the point about the lethality of and the effectiveness of arquebusier and therefore gunpowder weapons, even against the best heavy cavalry in the world, the French, who are decimated at Pavia. The casualties at Pavia are roughly 4% of the winners and 40% of the losers. So that's pretty bad. But that is starting to show already that change, because at the Battle of Crécy, the English who won the battle lost 0.1% of their army killed, of their men-at-arms, I should say, of their heavy troops. And because as long as they fought, they might get wounded, but then they're wounded through armor. They're not wounded that badly. They can get patched up, whereas the enemy who leave their wounded on the field to get trampled, stabbed, smothered, die in just much higher numbers, more like what you see at Pavia. So battle goes from being a situation where you can go in and expect with pretty good level of confidence that if you win, you will survive. If your side wins, you will survive, to a case where that is no longer the situation because of the arquebus and the effect of the sheer kinetic energy that gunpowder enables mankind to bring to the purpose of killing each other. All right, so thank you.